So kind of one thing I always think about when I'm thinking about like talking to philosophy, like talking about philosophy, is like I kind of feel like people probably don't really know very much about like what philosophy is probably like a pretty big problem of like, okay, you want to talk about philosophy? What's that? I feel like that's like how people kind of react to philosophy because we do such a bad job of like teaching it or telling about what it is in like high school and stuff. Even though, philosophy did kind of invent school as a concept, the first academy ever was Plato, made it Plato's Academy, but, you know, so I mean, it seems like they kind of pretty quickly forgot their roots, the school system, but, whatever. But no. Um, so yeah, that's one thing that makes it kind of hard to talk about philosophy is just that, like, there's a good chance that nobody will know what you're talking about. Um, just because there's some like people just think of philosophy as like your like life mottos that you have or whatever, like people just think of like that's my philosophy on things, like that's kind of I think how that kind of comes about in people's minds. So we'll by watching this video that I'm gonna put on, we can get actually into more of what it philosophy actually is in reality. So that'll be cool. So let's go for it.
Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today, as a special treat, we are going to be doing the map of philosophy. But before we get to that, a bit of a history about philosophy. So, once upon a time, philosophy was anything you can study. Everything in the realm of study was a type of philosophy. But as
This is true. Science used to be called, I think, like material philosophy or physical philosophy. Like, for example, I remember reading philosophy or reading Frankenstein in college, and them and like talking about like they talk about science in that book, obviously, because like that's a big thing in that book is like science, but like they call it, or I think they call it natural philosophy. I think that was actually what they called it. Um, so so yeah, it is definitely is the case that philosophy is kind of the root of study, I guess. So
time went on, different disciplines developed, and they started taking chunks out of philosophy. Things that were originally considered philosophy were turned into other disciplines, and those disciplines emerged and took on their own life and way of doing things, until we only had so much left that was philosophy.
okay, so I I think this is a good way of talking about this, but there is a problem, in my opinion, with this. So they're kind of laying out all these fields that kind of like became things within philosophy, like so economics. I have no problem with that. And I could actually tell you how all of these come from philosophy, like pretty easily. But just like as an example, like economics. So like, well, I guess he hasn't really got into what philosophy is, so maybe I should hold off on that. But um, I guess the only one of these that I would question, all of these I would agree with coming from philosophy, except for art is the only one that I would question because I could see why somebody would kind of claim that art is kind of following from philosophy, but I really am not convinced actually. For example, some of the well, because it will kind of depend on what you mean by philosophy, I guess, to some degree, maybe. Like if you just kind of think of philosophy as like critically thinking about things and like investigating things, and I guess sure you could say that art comes from it. But if you think of it as like a more of like a rigorous kind of thing, or like a studying kind of thing, or like I would say that art I'd say that art is probably like as old as philosophy, like at least. Like I think that like you can look at some of the earliest philosophers that we have any writings from, like some of the pre-Socratic philosophers, like going way back, and like a lot of what we have from their writings that they wrote is literally written in like verse, like they were writing poetry to like express their philosophy. So like some of the earliest philosophers that we have anything written on were using art to express their philosophy. So I kind of think philosophy and art kind of go like hand in hand, and one didn't kind of spawn from the other. I kind of think that they're they're kind of both like pretty like intrinsic things about people. Like art is kind of expression and philosophy is kind of investigation, you know, I guess. Like I don't really think that art is necessarily bound to the field of philosophy. Um, Even if it involves investigation within art, I think they go well together. But yeah, I don't think that I would question the notion that art is like a subsidiary of philosophy. But the rest of these, absolutely, no question whatsoever. They all come from philosophy for sure.
It couldn't be categorized into other disciplines. But philosophy still had its fingers in all of those other pies. You still had philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, philosophy of education, philosophy of mind. All of those things still existed in philosophy and served not merely as kind of an old version of what those people did, but rather a way to connect that discipline to other disciplines. Philosophy is that in-between substance, that thing that can actually connect both science and religion, that can put different disciplines on the same playing field to talk to each other. And all of these disciplines to this day still honor their original connection to philosophy, because everyone, when they get the highest degree in any of these disciplines, gets a PhD or a doctorate.
Yeah, that's true. That's what's funny. Is eventually when I do have my PhD, because I'm currently only at the bachelor's level, but when I eventually do have my PhD, my official title will be Doctor of Philosophy, because PhD means Doctor of Philosophy. So that is a kind of funny thing about like regarding that naming convention and all of that, you know. But so far, I think this is a pretty good way of talking about this in terms of like kind of providing the other fields of study kind of like the framework to kind of talk and communicate each other like with each other. I think that that's a pretty astute way of describing that, I would say.
In philosophy of whatever they're talking about. Therefore, I give you philosophy, the glue that holds all of the rest of academia together. Now, at the center of philosophy, you have logic and philosophical methods. These are the methods with which philosophy can connect these various disciplines, as well as kind of translate our normal language in something that can be evaluated and assessed by math and the simple rules of logic.
This is true, but this is not philosophy didn't start with logic necessarily. I mean, it kind of did, but it wasn't formalized. Like Socrates is kind of thought of as the first modern philosopher, you know, but he wasn't like like logic as a thing, like as a field of study, you know, like a formalized way of checking like argumentative rigor and truth, which I'm sure they'll kind of like talk a little bit about. But like that wasn't a thing for Socrates, you know. I think one of the earliest people to kind of start talking about some kind of logical principles, I think, was Aristotle, but I'm not 100% on that. But yeah, logic as a field, like they're kind of presenting it as in like you just have to be aware of the difference between the history of philosophy and what it currently is, because this is true of currently true of philosophy, that like logic is really the backbone and the basis of philosophy for sure, but it didn't start that way, I guess, necessarily. So you have to kind of realize why it started out, or why it is that way. So I'll kind of let them explain, and if I feel like they don't kind of justify why logic is kind of the backbone of philosophy and all that, and like what it serves and stuff like that, I'll jump in and explain that more.
So we'll start in this with formal classical logic, but we also have non-classical logic we'll look at, informal logic, and philosophical methods. So let's take a look first at formal classical logic. So the basic building blocks of formal classical logic are first-order logic. This starts off with propositional logic, which is kind of macro logic dealing with the relations between propositions and statements and the logic in between those. as well as categorical logic, which is kind of an older version of logic that works on the micro scale, that deals with subjects and predicates within each of those propositions and statements. Those two combined in the more modern era to form predicate calculus that quantifies over those individual subjects and predicates, but also works on the larger scale relating propositions to each other. When you take this a step further, you get to higher order logic. Higher order logic doesn't just quantify over objects. We don't just say for all apples. It quantifies over predicates as well. It can say for all types of thing that a certain thing is predicated of, for all sets that have 3 members. Included in this are things like type theory from Bertrand Russell. You have set theory, which advanced from that, which is dealing with sets of particular objects and rules about them, as well as arguably the philosophy of math, though philosophy of math could be just as easily put in metaphysics as a category, because it deals both with kind of the connection between math and logic, as well as questions about what the reality of particular mathematical objects is. Moving further outside of...
Okay, so I think I do want to talk about the importance of logic, because I don't think that this video seems like... well, no, they spend a good bit on logic, so maybe they will. Maybe... I think it's kind of weird to just kind of start talking about all these different types of logic without really talking about why logic is a thing, I guess. So I will just explain it. So why is logic important for philosophy? What is it that about philosophy that's like, why is logic like a big part in studying philosophy? The reason is, so you have to think about philosophy as kind of like what you're doing in philosophy is you're kind of thinking in order to understand the world, right? That's kind of what you're doing in philosophy, like to put it really simply, right? So why study like what makes philosophy anything different from just like being somebody who thinks about things at that point? Like why care about philosophy as opposed to just like figuring things out, like using whatever method or way of going about things that you want to go about it? Well, the reason is that philosophy has like objective standards that are like consistent and yields consistent, predictable results. So the thing that differentiates philosophy from any other kind of like way of going about like internally investigating the world, like using your thoughts, I guess, to investigate the world. The thing that's like logic is what separates philosophy from like any other way of going about that, like instead of just like thinking about it, like trying to figure it out using like intuition or like looking for like spiritual answers or anything like that. Like what separates philosophy is the use of logic. And so really what you have to think of what logic is it's essentially like math, but for like words and statements. So like we're able to kind of like objectively say like how certain statements and arguments kind of play out in the world. So like logic, like without logic you can't really tell so I guess basically like logic kind of provides you the system to kind of ascertain like validity in what people say and soundness in what people say, which is kind of just like a way of saying that like logic is kind of how you figure out if something is true or not. Like logic is kind of the standard for determining when something is like consistent, essentially. Like basically when somebody says an argument to you, like lays an argument out, like, well, I think that college should be free because if it's free, a lot more people will go to college, and if a lot more people go to college, then we'll have a lot better outcomes in society because we'll have people in higher positions in society. So somebody would lay that out as their argument, and then you could logically represent their argument and say like, so what they're trying to prove is that like we ought to have free college, and so the reasons like they would say like if we have free college, like assuming there was free college, there would be good outcomes, like that would be like how you would represent that, like logically. So you'd have to say like, if college was free, then we would have this good thing and this good thing. And then like by kind of breaking this down logically, you can kind of figure out like what is the part of this that you would need to like attack or not, like if you wanted to kind of disprove this. So like when the reason that somebody is arguing for free college is like because it would improve the standards, like the positions that people hold in society, somebody who wanted to argue against this would have to prove that in order to like refute that argument, essentially. Because like that's what it hinges on. Like this is kind of what logical systems are set up to kind of replicate and like to kind of break down and make it easier to understand like the truth and the validity of arguments, because an argument can be valid and false. Like you can say that everything that you're saying, like if assuming that every point that you made is true, then what you're saying would follow. Like if X, then Y, if Y, then Z, therefore Z. But like if Y is just not true, then like that would be a valid argument. Like if X did follow to Y, which followed to Z, like then that would be valid. But like if Y is just not the case, then that argument would not be sound, if that makes sense. So I guess hopefully that kind of makes sense for what logic is, I guess. I don't know if they'll explain it or not, but they're probably just going to keep going into the other kinds, but I guess we'll see.
Kind of the basics of classical logic. You have modal logics. These, we've done many series on modal logics, but they start with the idea of alethic modal logic, which is the most basic kind of modal logic. This is the logic of possibility and necessity. When you say something is necessary or something is possible, what do you mean? You'll note it's quite close to modality, the study of possible worlds, but modal logic can also map onto other things as a framework for understanding different ways that we speak. So you also have temporal logic, which is where we deal with the logic of time, the past, the present, the future, something that will always be or has always been. Also within the category of modal logics, you have epistemic logic. Epistemic logic is the logic of knowledge, belief, justification, how you can make logical arguments using those tools. And we also have deontic logic. Deontic logic is the logic of ethics and obligation, particularly when you're in a particular form of ethical theory, which we'll get to in a bit. Now we're going to move on to non-classical logic. So non-classical logics generally deny or question kind of one of the basic premises of classical logic. So we have many valued logics. This is more than just true and false. A very popular version of this is known as fuzzy logic, that there are lines of in between something being true and false. You also have computability logic. This deals with not what is true in terms of logic, but what we can prove and provability.
So this is a worthwhile distinction here. Not all logic is about truth or not, but that's what most logic is. But there is of course, like he is pointing out, there is plenty of other applications to use logic. Like for example, like this one that he's talking about, computability logic, of what you can prove. You know, we have other ways of logically representing things that are other than just like, is it true or not? But that is the most common and probably the most useful, is like classical logic in terms of like figuring out the truth of things and stuff like that.
You also have linear logic. Linear logic works with kind of a combination of intuitionistic logic, which we'll get to in a sec, and classical logic. You have non-reflexive logic, which in certain ways denies the law of identity and saying that identity isn't necessarily reflexive. You have relevance logic as well. Relevance logic talks about concerns dealing with kind of the conditional in logic, if-then statements, talking about do if-then statements, does the antecedent and the conditional need to be related? In classical logic, they don't need to be. Relevance logic puts a requirement on them that they do need to be related. Intuitionistic logic. Intuitionistic logic denies the law of the excluded middle and questions that. And there are many, many more non-classical logics. You have paraconsistent logic, non-monotonic logic, and many more. But the basic idea in this section of logic is these are logics that question some basic tenet of kind of our formal classical logic. Now we're going to move on to informal logic. So when I'm talking about informal logic here, informal logic isn't particularly well defined. We're going to talk really about non-deductive kinds of logic. Deductive logic is what we've been looking at so far, where the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. In inductive arguments, for the example, inductive arguments claim that the truth of the premises makes the conclusion more likely. So inductive arguments look at taking a lot of specific cases and generalizing from them. Every time I have dropped this rock, it has gone towards the ground. Therefore, every time I will drop the rock, it will go towards the ground. I've taken specific cases and I've generalized for them.
This is very important. You absolutely need to know the difference between inductive arguments and deductive arguments. It's like it is a huge distinction. Like deductive arguments are certain. Like when you're arguing deductively, you are proving something like as a matter of fact if your argument is valid and sound. So like if you set up a deductive argument, it is assuming that it works. There's no room whatsoever for doubt because it is like it is infallible in terms of the system. You know, like it is definitively going to say if something is right or wrong based on how it works. Whereas inductive arguments are like they're saying probabilistic based. So they're things like because you're arguing that it seems most likely that this will happen. That's how inductive arguments go, which is how most arguments ever made in the world ever are. Like, so you need to understand when something is inductive or deductive. Most of the time it's going to be inductive, meaning that you're speaking in probability in terms of your argument, and that it seems most likely that this will be the case. So like you inductively argue that your car is going to start when you turn the key because that's what's happened in the past, but like it could not be the case, like, or it could be the case that the next time you go to use your car it just doesn't start. So it's a probabilistic argument that it seems like it will start, but there would be no contradiction like if it didn't start. So like you have to understand that the difference between an inductive argument and a deductive argument. Whereas like a deductive argument would say like about the cars, you could say like inductive or deductively you could say if the car is in proper order and I turn the key, then the car will start, which would be deductively valid and sound because there's no room for error in that. So there we go.
This is what's done a lot in science. Abductive arguments, on the other hand, are arguments towards the best explanation. Based on all of the pieces of information we have so far, the best explanation for this is something. A famous abductive argument, of course, is the watch argument for the existence of God. Basically, the idea that if you're walking out in the world and you discover a watch, the best explanation for that watch is that it had a designer of some kind. Note, though, that abductive arguments, like inductive arguments, are not deductively valid. The truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion.
True. But also, that there's plenty of reasons why that's a bad argument that he said about the watchmaker intelligent design, but that's not really relevant. I guess it's just an example of the argument. But yeah, you have to be careful about abductive arguments because a lot of conspiracy theorists will use abductive arguments to kind of link together a bunch of like broad points and to kind of use it to like sell their narrative. And they'll say like, if you take this point and this point and this point, the best way to explain all three of these points is my conspiracy theory, which the conspiracy theory itself may have no truth, but like this is the abductive argument. And that's like, you have to be careful about that. Like you have to really question the premises that they're building it on, and if it makes sense that this would follow from it, you have to be careful, because abductive arguments are just kind of like more flimsy inductive arguments almost. Like that's kind of like what they are in a sense.
Now we're going to talk a bit about philosophical methods. So all of these arguments are working with premises that we've come up with in some way and seeing what we can get from those premises, what we can conclude from them using various systems of logic. Philosophical methods looks more at how we get those premises to begin with, specifically using a couple different techniques of philosophy. So one technique that's used by many philosophers is thought experiments. Thought experiments start with a philosopher saying, imagine that this is the case, and it tries to lead your intuition, which we'll touch on in a sec, to a particular conclusion. It gives you the intuition that, and based on that intuition, a philosopher will conclude something else using that intuition and logic.
Very important.
Experimental philosophy studies these particular intuitions. It looks into what the most common intuitions are, whether or not certain intuitions are justified either through the sources that we use to create them, through their popularity, and so on. Experimental philosophy, interestingly, is one of the more recent fields in philosophy, and it actually uses empirical research as opposed to everything else, which is more armchair philosophy, which just uses someone thinking in a chair.
Whoa. Armchair philosophy is such a bad term to use there, because the whole thing, like, armchair philosophy would be trying to do philosophy without using logic. That's what armchair philosophy would be, because armchair kind of implies that you're just kind of doing this, like as a hobby, like, without really kind of, like, taking the field that you're engaging in seriously. You know, you're kind of like a dilettante, kind of. Like, I don't like calling it armchair, just like I get what he's trying to say with there, but it sounds like you're kind of like emphasizing the importance of logic into philosophy. That kind of is what kind of distinguishes just the armchair philosopher from the field of philosophy, is like the field of logic and that kind of objective system that yields good results. That's kind of what separates it. So I don't really like that term, but I think we still can get what he's saying, though.
Intuitions are those things that we're talking about. They're your feeling or your impression, your seeming, what, when presented with a particular situation, you would generally assent to or agree with, as opposed to what you wouldn't agree with. And those intuitions are kind of what we use as the basic building blocks to build some of the premises and arguments that we build in philosophy. So that's logic and philosophical methods. That forms kind of the heart of philosophy. That is the thing, if nothing else, which holds together all the varied and disparate disciplines of philosophy. These are not everything in logic, but this is a lot of the big players when you're talking about logic. Also, note, in this video, we're talking a lot about analytic philosophy. When you go to things like continental philosophy and other things like that, they may have different ways of even talking about.
Continental philosophy is I saw a YouTube video by the Blonde Philosophy. It's their only YouTube video, and they're on Twitch as the Silly Serious, I believe, where they say that continental philosophy is philosophy for people who wanted to be a poet but whose parents didn't let them. You know, so like Nietzsche wanted to be a poet, but his parents didn't let him, but he had to be a philosopher. That's what continental philosophy is, where it's like logic is much less important in continental philosophy, because it's a lot more like broad, kind of like what feels like, you know, what kind of feels like the right thing, and what kind of like gives us kind of meaning in our human experience and that kind of stuff. It's a different kind of thing. But I have a bit of a bias to analytical philosophy for sure. But I mean, there are definitely good and important things for continental philosophy, but it's a different kind of thing, for sure. And I think like you gotta know analytic philosophy. I think I think it's much more important for somebody to understand analytic philosophy than continental philosophy, for sure. I would say. I think you could go your whole life knowing nothing of continental philosophy and survive and do a pretty good job of understanding a lot of things in life. But I think not understanding analytic philosophy is gonna make it a hard time, like a more hard time for you, essentially.
Out or understanding logic in terms that Hegel or someone like that might present. But with that in mind, we're going to move on to history and traditions of philosophy, where we'll briefly touch on both the history of philosophy, but also some different traditions of philosophy. So we'll start with the history of philosophy. Generally, you can divide philosophy up into a couple different eras or periods of time. A lot of times the ancient Greeks and Romans are kind of lumped together. This is where you have people like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, but also many more. Man. You have positions like Stoicism, Skepticism, Atomism, Cyrenaicism, Epicureanism, and so on, which arise during this period, but also many more. This is kind of...
Dude, I do think that reading The Republic by Plato is very much worthwhile. I think there's a lot of really interesting and relevant things that I actually have brought up a lot in my conversations about philosophy, because I think it's important. So I want to just emphasize, like, it's one of the things that you're going to hear about in philosophy, like Plato's Republic, but like for good reason, because it's there's a lot of really good stuff in there that's like really interesting and like important to the development of philosophy and like how we think about things even today, and all that.
Considered the birthplace of philosophy, where at least the Western philosophical tradition starts. So, of course, there are many other philosophical traditions as well. In kind of this Western tradition continuing to follow it, we next have medieval philosophy. This has a lot of the scholastics. The scholastics basically had...
By far the area of philosophy I know the least about, for sure. I probably know the most about Aquinas out of the people they have listed on here, for sure. And I mean, I know Saint Anselm of Canterbury. Like, I know like the ontological argument very well and all that, but
the ancient Greek texts in the Bible, and they tried to make them make sense together. It has Thomism and patrology. If you go back farther in the kind of Christian tradition, you have such philosophers as St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, Boethius, and St. Anselm of Canterbury. Moving forward in time, as we start to...
I think this is another big part. Descartes is huge. Locke is, of course, huge. Leibniz, big deal. Hobbes is a big deal, for sure. The whole rationalism and empiricism debate is like a massive thing, and that Kant is kind of the responsible one for solving, but they're going to get into Kant
into the Renaissance. You have 17th century philosophy, also sometimes known as early modern philosophy, where you have such philosophers as René Descartes, John Locke, Gottfried Leibniz. You have positions like rationalism, empiricism, idealism, dualism. In kind of more political philosophy of thinkers like Thomas Hobbes that emerge.
This is the area of philosophy. Well, I like ancient philosophy a lot too, but I like this part of it a lot too. And I like current stuff too. I just am not very interested in medieval philosophy.
Having kind of this renaissance of ideas, the recreation of ideas, and we start having some of these philosophical arguments that we haven't really had since the ancient Greeks again, and start advancing on them and coming...
True. That's why I feel like kind of with the medieval era, we kind of took a break from a lot of the stuff that I think is pretty like more important and influential. I mean, I'm not going to deny that there were important and good and like worthwhile things and stuff, but medieval philosophy is so theological and religious focused, I feel like. So that's kind of so I feel like it just kind of, a lot of it just kind of became like less relevant or irrelevant today, I think, because religion is dying. Like, we just got to be honest that it's a dying thing. It's on the way out.
Up with new ideas
over time.
Moving into 18th century philosophy,
these are some of the big hitters here, though. Rousseau, Kant, Hume, and Voltaire, but I like the other three way more. These are some... well, I don't like Rousseau, but I know more about him. But I have a lot of problems with Rousseau. But these are some big guys. Like, Rousseau was, like, massive. Hume is super, super important and really good. He's one of my favorite philosophers. And Kant is also one of my favorite philosophers. It's hard to understate how important Kant is to philosophy and the developments of it as a field. He, like, I mentioned the whole a minute ago, the debate between empiricism and rationalism, which is a huge debate in philosophy, basically about like how we get information, which is like empiricism, like how information is kind of ascertained. Is it through thinking and like reasoning, or is it through experience? Like essentially, that was like through experiencing things. Like that was the big debate between rationalism and empiricism that Kant really settled with a lot of his work, especially Critique of Pure Reason.
The ideas here are really dominated by Kant, of course, and Hume, who are talking about a lot of the ideas that were brought up in the 17th century, but advancing them further, trying to maybe solve some of those problems or move on to new ideas.
Which Kant did. He solved actually tons of problems, and that's like he gets a lot of credit for that, like for solving these conundrums that like baffled people in the last century and before that.
You, of course, also have people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire in this period that are presenting ideas. Hume and Kant are some of the most influential philosophers in all of the history of philosophy, and so this is a very important time for what would influence philosophy moving forward. In the 19th century, philosophy really blooms and expands even more. You have philosophers like John Stuart Mill, Hegel, William James, Friedrich Nietzsche. You have a bunch of new positions that are emerging like German idealism, pragmatism, utilitarianism, and transcendentalism that appear during this time. And philosophy starts to expand just as more people get educated and are able to engage in that philosophical discussion. Moving forward, you now move on to 20th century philosophy, which of course blooms even more. You have the greats like Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. You have Karl Popper, Martin Heidegger, Thomas Kuhn, David Lewis, Kurt Gödel, Quine, Sartre. The list could go on and on. But the more recent we get, the more difficult it gets to sum up smaller and smaller periods of time with a very quick look into that period in philosophy. We are in the process of making videos right now on a list of great philosophers, and we are going to look more into the history of philosophy. But for now, that's a very, very, very brief look into kind of some of the history of philosophy and how philosophy advanced over time.
That's fair.
Now we're going to talk about some various traditions in philosophy. I will fully admit before we get into this that I am an analytic philosopher. I am based in analytic philosophy, so anything that I present in here that is incorrect or someone that's better versed in one of these other traditions of philosophy, please correct me in the comments, but I'm going to do my best. So, analytic philosophy generally is pervasive throughout the English-speaking world and has been for a while, and analytic philosophy is a tradition that's built out of the tradition we were kind of looking at that starts with the ancient Greeks and moves forward. But there are many other philosophical traditions that move forward. So in North America right now, we're mostly English-speaking philosophers, and so analytic philosophy is awfully dominant, but there are other traditions here, such as Native American philosophy. A lot of Native American philosophy has dealt with sovereignty, power, the idea of indigenous rights over certain lands, and has often been shaped by colonialism, since a lot of philosophy, or at least something that would be considered philosophy, came from people that came and colonized the Americas as well as other parts around the world. You have also Afro-Caribbean philosophy. This talks a lot about multiculturalism as well, of course, as colonialism and imperialism. Moving on to Latin American philosophy. Latin American philosophy often deals with issues like identity and specifically social issues in philosophy. There's also a good tradition of feminist philosophy within Latin American philosophy. Now, you have in Europe what might be considered one of the main traditions that kind of opposes analytic philosophy, which is known as continental philosophy. We're very, very briefly going to just list a couple of the positions that exist in continental philosophy and not in any way get into explaining what it is or if it even is its own separate thing. Continental philosophy includes things like phenomenology, post-structuralism, hermeneutics, existentialism, critical theory, speculative realism, German idealism, and...
Critical theory? You mean like critical race theory? That's not okay. We need to get rid of this crap.
More. I have a video on analytic versus continental philosophy that just barely touches the surface of this distinction. Hopefully we'll do more on continental philosophy because I know it's a very popular topic in the future, but for now we're going to keep going. So African philosophy is a difficult topic. As you may be aware, I live in Africa, but Africa is a huge place, and to kind of explain all of Africa under one philosophy is very difficult. But Also, Africa has not had, similar to kind of Native American philosophy and Latin American philosophy, been grossly impacted by its colonialist history. There's many philosophers that say that while the West was driven to philosophy through leisure time and just wanting to do it, Africans were forced to do philosophy to defend their own rights and defend their ideas. So there's a lack of a consistency within African philosophy. It's difficult as well because there's a very distinct difference between North African and Sub-Saharan culture, but also Sub-Saharan and North African development. You see a lot of philosophers in the ancient Greek and Roman period who are actually coming out of North Africa. You have all these interesting ideas that come out of North Africa. Carneades himself came from North Africa, came from Cyrene, which is in present-day Libya. And so that is in stark contrast with Sub-Saharan Africa, which had kind of not as many things that, at least in the modern day, we would consider philosophy until colonialism came and, in the words of some African philosophers, forced them to begin philosophy. Now, opposing quote-unquote Western philosophy, you have Eastern philosophy, which is certainly kind of a disjunctive kind in the sense that it's not a natural kind out there. Eastern philosophy doesn't encompass one tradition, but rather an accumulation of many
Eastern philosophy, aka bullshit.
different
Just kidding. I'm just kidding. I don't know enough about Eastern philosophy, but to kind of give like a full accurate assessment of it, but I think I can very safely say, however, that Eastern philosophy has had significantly less of an impact on the world than Western philosophy, specifically analytical philosophy, because of the fact that it's kind of doesn't really use things like logic necessarily. It's kind of more like continental-ish, like the way that continental philosophy works a little bit, and a lot of it is kind of like spiritual kind of stuff. Like, it's not for me, that's for sure. I'm more into the kind of rigorous stuff, analytical kind of stuff, rather than like the kind of like what feels right in the soul kind of stuff, you know. But that's kind of like what Eastern philosophy is.
Traditions that kind of are separate from Western philosophy, but unlike a lot of the philosophies that were in the developing world, Eastern philosophy existed long before a lot of the colonialist things or the expansion and the age of discovery, though I know that's not the best word for that. But moving on, we have Chinese philosophy, which deals with Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism is a part of that. Chinese philosophy and Confucius were very impactful throughout the region. You'll see many of these different philosophies have some element of Confucius or Confucianism in them, so that's very important. You have Japanese philosophy, which combines kind of Shinto original cultural beliefs with Buddhism as well as Confucianism, and even...
And if you really don't care that much about like Shintoism, Buddhism, that kind of stuff, it's like that's not really, you know... I'm not into the whole spiritual kind of stuff, you know. Like, I mean, there are things you can get from it for sure, but like, I think that Western philosophy does a much better job of getting to these things, in my opinion.
In more modern times, developing how that combines with Western philosophy. You have even Korean philosophy, which, similar to Japanese philosophy, combines kind of Buddhism, but also a Neo-Confucianism, and sometimes includes shamanism. Separate from all of that, you have Indian philosophy, which very...
Dude, why is Indian philosophy so low res, dude? Oh my god. It's like bootleg. It's like they're trying to say something.
Much exists as its own philosophy compared to a lot of other Eastern schools which bring in different philosophies to that. There are really 10 major schools of Indian philosophy. There are 4 heterodox schools and 6 orthodox schools. I could do an entire series on Indian philosophy that would take up an entire year doing every single day. It's a complicated topic, but understand that it is very much its own philosophy. You also have Tibetan philosophy, just as Chinese philosophy in some ways gave rise to Confucianism. You have Tibetan philosophy, which is...
Dude, what I want to know is, why the fuck is Tibet still ain't free? You know what? You know what I mean? Why Tibet still ain't free? Why the fuck is Tibet still ain't free? Yeah, dude, this is my favorite. This is probably my favorite album by Viper. Is Why the Fuck is Tibet Still Ain't Free by Viper. Highly recommend. You're gonna wanna check that out. It's really good stuff. anyways.
Associated with Buddhism, which is as much a religion as a philosophy, and includes all of those elements of Buddhism, such as a formal debate system as well as cultural practices. Something else that sometimes gets classified as Eastern philosophy, though technically
No,
it's
thank
somehow
you.
in
Just
between,
kidding.
is
Just
Islamic
kidding.
philosophy. It has a wide range of topics that are covered, more than a lot of these other kind of separate philosophies it could pull from the West, because especially during the Middle Ages, the Arab world was the place where a lot of the ancient Greek texts were preserved. So there are many Islamic philosophers who, beyond just kind of relating things to the Quran, have separate opinions on things like metaphysics, post-colonial opinions, illuminationist schools, transcendent schools, things like that, that move to create Islamic philosophy as its own separate category. Once again, another thing that I could do an entire series on. Polynesian philosophy is another thing that kind of has a lot of that post-colonialist piece to it, though there was some kind of pre-colonialism metaphysics and cosmology that came along with it. And when we get down to Australia, once again, in the English-speaking world, analytic philosophy dominates a lot, though Australian realism has had its own kind of rise and its own identification as Australian philosophy, having its own identity within the analytic philosophy world. Whew! So that was a lot of different places. Like I said, if you disagree with anything I said in that quick snapshot of philosophical traditions, please offer it in the comments below. I'm not an expert on a lot of these varying philosophies, so please help me out. And that has covered history and traditions of philosophy, but we are far from done. So next we're going to take a look at value theory. Value theory is kind of the area of philosophy that may be most applicable towards daily life. We'll separate it into three areas. We'll start with aesthetics. So
aesthetics is one of my favorite areas of philosophy that I feel is very underrepresented and not taken seriously enough in academia. I think it's super important, and aesthetics should be one of the big ones in my opinion. I think aesthetic philosophy it should be super duper valued. We should have people thinking about what makes good art and what makes good music and what makes good film and literature, and what is beautiful. I think these are things that would be much more important for people's happiness in life if they thought more about these things. I think this is very important in my opinion.
Aesthetics,
but of course it's going to get glossed over because it's not viewed as important in academia right now as I believe it to be. But there are still aesthetic philosophers out there doing stuff. Aristotle kind of got the aesthetic tradition kind of going with poetics,
dealing with things like the philosophy of beauty, but also the philosophy of art, things that are pretty, things that are nice, things that are sublime or horrific. We'll look at the philosophy of art first. So the philosophy of art asks questions like, what is art? What can be classified as art? What is high?
These are things I really like talking about and discussing, and I wish that more people were interested and cared about this kind of stuff about like what is art and what is good art. Because I think asking this allows you to get a lot more out of art.
Art, what is popular art, but it also can be divided into specific philosophies of particular types of art. So you have things like the philosophy of literature, the philosophy of film, the philosophy of music, the philosophy of visual art, and any art that you can have a philosophy of that, looking into the specific interesting questions that are posed by that type of art.
And I really like doing this, and this is stuff I want to continue to write more and more about in my philosophical career, is like kind of the aesthetics of kinds of art like that. I think that would be something that I really would like to do.
Because art looks so different across these media, it's difficult to have one set view on what is art that can encompass all of these different perspectives. You also have the philosophy of beauty. This deals with aesthetic judgment, aesthetic value, aesthetic cognition. So basically, what we judge to be beautiful, what we value as something that is something beautiful valuable, whether or not
Sublime, dude, I love that band.
What we're thinking and what's going on in our brain when we're experiencing beauty, but it also deals with things like the sublime. Is sublime a different experience from beauty, and how can we categorize sublime? It deals with things like humor. What is funny to us? Is funny a type of beautiful? What makes something funny? Horror. Why do we enjoy things being horrific or frightening? And more. So that's kind of a brief snapshot into aesthetics. Next, we'll touch on social and political philosophy. So in terms of political philosophy, there are a lot of topics here, and it really has turned into its own field of political theory, but it has a deep, deep history in philosophy. This is dealing with questions of what is justice, especially as you go back to the ancient Greeks.
One thing I think is cool to note is that a lot of the founding fathers of America were very well versed in philosophy, and especially political philosophy too. Like a lot of them were like very much like Enlightenment men. Like they were very familiar with a lot of the philosophical arguments in terms of how to organize governments, and you can really get a good sense of how our government is organized by considering this, because like Thomas Jefferson, for example, was like the head of the philosophical society of his state of Virginia, like. So he was like very interested in philosophy. He had like picture frames of Locke and two other philosophers, I think, in his house. I don't remember which ones, but like he like was very well versed in philosophy, and like it definitely, a lot of the way that our government is structured is like influenced by philosophical writings of people like even like Plato and everything like that. Like Plato's anti-democratic arguments are like pretty influential in the ways that we have our system set up to kind of protect against the tyranny of the majority. You know, like Plato kind of is like pretty influential in all that, and philosophy in general. You know,
idea of what justice is was an important question. But also it asks questions about government. What are the best types of government for us to have? What are ways that we should...
None, because I'm a libertarian and I know what I'm talking about with politics. Just kidding.
Choose government? How much power should a government have over its people? It deals with questions of freedom. This is things like free speech, the freedom of movement, but also people's general freedom in comparison to their government and in comparison to the people that are ruling them.
That's me. I'm the philosopher of
anarchy?
chaos.
Should we have dictatorship? How can we negotiate somewhere in between?
That is something my friends call me as a joke, is the philosopher of chaos. It is a joke that we came up with because of how silly it sounds.
Political philosophy deals with many things. It goes through law, it goes political theory, war, international development, human rights, and much, much more. This is a huge area of philosophy, once again, but here's just a quick snapshot of some of the big issues. Social philosophy is another thing that kind of fits under this category because it works alongside political philosophy. Here are a couple of the big areas that people talk about.
Oh, cringe, dude, cringe. Just kidding.
About feminism is a huge part of philosophy. It is a philosophy on its own. First, second, and third wave feminism have elements which exist in philosophy as much as they exist as a social movement. You have questions about equality.
Why is scrap metal and Halloween? Oh, because it's television? Oh, okay. But Halloween? 7 feet tall? What? Is Halloween is a movie? This is a very weird picture.
Which are a huge part of social philosophy, asking on what things should we be equal and on what things should we not be equal. I think the story of Harrison Bergeron is a great kind of setup for some of these questions of clearly we shouldn't be equal on everything, but we should be equal on some things.
So like
the
Tom
philosophy
Bergeron?
Of culture, which deals with a lot of the things we were just talking about in traditions of philosophy, how philosophy and culture can intermingle, and also questions relating to culture, what culture is, how culture is created, what things are created by culture, and so on. But also we have things like the philosophy of gender, the philosophy of race, the philosophy of sex, the philosophy of sexuality, and more and more. Just as these things grow, so do the philosophies that are related to them. Just as any of the disciplines we looked at the beginning grow, so must the philosophies which can translate the ideas presented into those disciplines into a language that all of academia can speak grows. So that is, once again, a very brief snapshot into social and political philosophy. The last area of value theory is probably one of the most commonly associated with value theory, and it is one of the areas that frequently people are thinking about when they're thinking about philosophy. It's moral theory and ethics. So this can kind of be divided into three parts. So we have ethics such as meta-ethics. Meta-ethics...
Ethics, by the way, by far the most important in terms of like how much attention gets dedicated into and all that. Area of philosophy for sure. Ethics is where like is kind of the most like popping off field of philosophy for sure. Like people seem to be most interested in what is like right and wrong and good and bad and stuff like that right now. I'm interested in it too. Like I think it's an interesting area of philosophy that I like and I'm interested in, but I personally find it just so much harder than other fields like metaphysics, for instance. But there's a lot of still cool and interesting stuff.
This is asking the question, what type of thing is good? What type of thing is evil? Is something being good just an opinion that we have? Is it someone just saying, yay, this is good, I like it? Or is it actually something that exists completely separate from our subjective views about good? Is it something that exists naturally? Is it something that exists just based on our creation of it? And that's a big question in meta-ethics. In normative ethics, we kind of have an assumption that good is something we're going to be talking about, and we're asking, how can we divide things into good and bad? What's a general theory that we can use to divide particular acts or particular...
By the way, meta-ethics is weird, for sure. I'm not entirely decided on meta-ethics and its value. You should understand meta-ethics for sure, but definitely not first. I think meta-ethics should come like later on, I think, like later down the line probably. Like you can understand ethics without having to understand meta-ethics, I think, but I don't know, maybe it's helpful.
People into good and bad people. Three of the main theories in normative ethics are consequentialism, which has things like utilitarianism, that whatever is doing the most good is creating is good, and you have rule utilitarianism versus act utilitarianism. Consequentialism generally focuses on the consequences of an action to determine if it's good or not. You have deontology, which looks things like divine command theory, but also Kantian ethics. This is kind of making very specific rules. If you follow these rules, you will be good. Virtue ethics, which looks more at the virtue of a person, which talks about virtues and vices. This is going all the way back to Aristotle, though it's had a resurgence recently. Virtues being kind of the balance between two vices. If someone acts virtuously, they're doing good. If you act as a virtuous person would, then you're acting in a good way. And this has a lot of play in with what we saw earlier, deontic logic, the logic of ethics and obligation, especially when you're dealing with kind of rules or that kind of either rule utilitarianism or rules in terms of deontology or another theory of ethics, which can be then formulated into kind of logical sentences.
By the way, right now, I do consider myself a deontologist, I would say, but I also think virtue ethics is good too, because... And I'm also kind of a consequentialist because I don't think that they go contrary to each other. I think deontology is my favorite form of consequentialism when applied on the personal level with virtue ethics is what I would say for anybody who that makes sense to. Which is not a traditional way of thinking about these things because traditionally these are posed as like opposing each other, but I think they're not.
Going a step further, kind of zooming in down on ethics, you have applied ethics. Applied ethics takes those normative theories and applies them to specific real problems that we have in the world. These are things like biomedical ethics, business ethics, environmental ethics, professional ethics, political ethics, social ethics, technology ethics, development ethics, and much, much more. Whenever you're actually asking about a real world problem, is this person's actions, are they good or bad? That's a question in applied ethics. And applied ethics, as much as any area of philosophy, has its fingers in any pie where you're dealing with really any kinds of questions of what should you do? What is good for you to do? So, That's a brief glimpse into value theory, our third kind of general area of philosophy we're going to look into. And the last two areas kind of meld together, so we'll look at them simultaneously, and then we will look at the whole map. So,
By the way, I don't think I really hear people say value theory very much, by the way. So most of these other terms I think you could use, but I don't know if I'd use value theory as a term very much. Like aesthetics kind of fall under that for sure, like I guess, but most people would say aesthetics is kind of the field rather than value theory is the field, but I don't know. Most people would say that like uh, ethics and aesthetics are just two separate fields rather than like lumping them all under this field of value theory. But if that makes, I see why they did it though, because it is kind of all talking about value in some way, I guess. So it makes sense why they would kind of lump it like that. But just keep in mind that value theory is not like a thing that people say though. Those are thought of as different fields.
first off, we'll talk a bit about epistemology. So, epistemology is a big complex word which means the study of knowledge. Knowledge is generally considered by philosophers to be true, justified belief.
That comes from Plato. I'm sure he'll explain what that means. But one thing is that technically epistemology is a field of metaphysics, technically, which he hasn't talked about metaphysics yet, but I think you'll see why when he does talk about metaphysics, why that is the case.
Or true warranted belief, as you will. This is dealing with the principles of knowledge, the varieties of knowledge, and the definitions of knowledge. That's what we're studying when we're talking about epistemology.
Oh, so he's not even going to talk about what a justified true belief is then. So, like, in order, what Plato says that I agree with and that pretty much everybody after him agrees with, I would say, is that in order to, like, know that you're right, I guess, or that something that you believe is like the case, it has to you have to have a justified true belief, and those are all independent of each other. All three words of that statement, they're all logically independent. So justified means that you have to have a good reason for why you believe what you believe. True means that it has to be true, as in representative of reality. And belief means that you believe it. So, for example, one could have a true belief that's not justified. So, I could say that I'll use an example that one of my professors used. Let's say that I hold the belief that Santa is not real, right? Which I do feel confident in saying that Santa's not real, unfortunately. But so let's say I say Santa is not real, and you're like, yeah, sure, but why do you think that? And I'm like, well, this was the example my philosophy professor used. And it's like, well, one time when I was a kid, Santa was in my house actually, but my mom saw him and like intruding in the house or whatever, and she shot him and he died. So that's actually that's how I know now that Santa's not real, is because he was real, but he was in my house and my mom shot and killed him, so he's dead now. So that's how I know Santa's not real. So what we would call that person who says that is somebody who has a true belief that is not justified. So we would say this person does not know what they're talking about. They do not have knowledge, is what we would say. You can also have you can have justified false beliefs also, I guess. Like, if you've never been presented better arguments or reasons, no, I guess you can't have a justified true belief or a justified belief that isn't true. Well, I guess you can, I guess, but yeah, you just have to keep in mind that it wouldn't be true. Like you could say somebody's justified for believing something, but like based on like their abductive reasoning or their inductive reasoning, you could say like it's justified that this is what you would conclude, but like because you're missing out on this piece of information, for instance, you have your belief is not true. So, and then once you've been presented with this piece of information, if you don't like change your point of view, then at that point you don't have a justified true belief anymore. At that point you just have a belief that you're no longer justified in believing, and it was never true in the first place. So that's kind of an important thing, I think, that I wish they would have done to break down what a justified true belief is, because I think it's a very important thing.
But this can expand to other things. So epistemic states and properties, when we're dealing with belief, we have to talk about the state of believing something or the state of being justified. But we can also talk about the state of being wise or the state of being epistemically lucky, just getting things right even though you might not have good reasons for it. Being epistemically defeated, being rational, being warranted, or having something be based on something else. We also talk about social epistemology, where you have more than one person trying to know something, where you have trust, where you have interactions between people. Do you trust someone else's beliefs? And that's why you're justified in holding a particular belief or knowing a particular belief. You have collective mentality. You have social choice procedures, how we make choices as a whole based on our beliefs, and much more. You also have the sources of our epistemic knowledge. This comes down to one of the big distinctions in philosophy between a posteriori and a priori. A posteriori knowledge being knowledge that we get from the world with experience, and a priori knowledge being knowledge we get independent of experience.
That's true. He could have explained that better, though. Yeah, a priori just means before experience, and a posteriori just means after experience. So that's a pretty important distinction to know, though. Like something that you realize through rationally thinking, or that you realize through experience. Essentially, that's a pretty big thing. You'll learn that in like day one of like tons of philosophy classes, though.
And this also digs down into specific types of experiences you can have. You can experience memory, testimony, reasoning, but also seemings, intuition, as we talked about before, and perception, as we will talk about in a moment. You also have tons of individual epistemic theories, such as skepticism or pragmatism, but also things like foundationalism, coherentism, contextualism, internalism, externalism, infinitism, reliabilism, rationalism, empiricism, and much, much more. In the future, I hope to do videos on all of these theories, but as you see, there's so much in philosophy to cover, it would take a lifetime to do it all. And you'll notice also we're right next to epistemic logic, once again, building into our logical framework that connects all these areas of philosophy and even all the areas of academic discourse down to a logical framework that we can speak about these things such that people aren't talking past.
Yeah, this is the thing. All academic discourses are at one point, like, they all rely on logic. Logic is like the fundamental building block of our words and our speech. Like, this is how we know when things are true or not, is through logic. Like, if I think it's pretty important to like kind of understand that, like, no matter what field of academia you're in, you are ultimately subject to logic. You can't escape logic in any field, because they all spawn from philosophy, which uses logic as the basis of it. So if you just kind of ignore logic, like, and you say like you can practice without like understanding the why something is true or not, like through logic, like there's a you don't quite understand the basis of your field at that point, I would say.
Each other. So that's a brief glimpse into epistemology. You'll note there are some other things in this yellow color, but before we get to that, we're going to jump into our last area, which is metaphysics.
And as I said, you could put epistemology under metaphysics, and a lot of people would. I would as well.
So there are many, many different things in metaphysics, and it's a huge category. We're going to cover a number of them here, but there's always going to be more. So one of them is ontology. Ontology is the study of things that exist. It tries to...
I like how he just doesn't even talk about what metaphysics is. He's just like, okay, we're going to talk about metaphysics, and then he just starts talking about the first part of metaphysics without even saying what metaphysics is. Like, I get why, because it would make... what metaphysics is would make more sense after you know, like, different parts of metaphysics, maybe, but... I'd like to at least try to say what metaphysics is, but first, I guess. So, like, if you think of physics, it's like how bodies, or how material things, those are the same thing. Like, how physical bodies or material things, like, their properties or how they move in the world, essentially. Like, that's what physics is. Like, you're calculating, like motion of things like speed and, like, how things move, and, like, the math behind bodies taking up space, essentially, is kind of like what physics is. Metaphysics is kind of like that, is kind of like, it's not that, but it's like metaphysics is kind of like the if we think about physics as like the math of the physical world, metaphysics is kind of like the the logic of the mental world, essentially, where you're kind of figuring out um you're kind of figuring out how the world works through the like ideal kind of way, or um through argumentation and stuff like that. um like, and so like one part of this ontology, like for things that exist, like trying to figure out what exists in the world, um like what how can you say something exists like as a part of the world, like metaphysics is like a much more broad, Aristotle kind of said metaphysics as meaning like post physics, like once, like that was kind of what Aristotle was thinking, which is kind of a silly way to think about it, we see now, but like once you kind of understood physics, Aristotle would say, then like you can kind of do metaphysics and kind of understand, like, okay, now that I get like the physics of stuff, now I can kind of back up and look at the metaphysics of stuff. That's kind of what the thought of that was. So it's like once I kind of get how this works on like a mathematical, like physical level, then I can kind of step back and understand it on a mental ideal level. That's kind of like the principle behind metaphysics.
Divide the world into objects that exist and objects that don't exist. And different ontologies say that everything exists, nothing exists, or somewhere in between. Philosophy of objects talk about different types of objects. What are objects made of? What even are separate objects and things like that. You have Mariology, which breaks those objects down even further, talking about the part-hood relation. What do we mean when we're talking about parts of something? You have identity, once again, kind of relating to objects. Why is an object the same object over time if parts of it change?
This is a pretty interesting part of philosophy that there's a lot of interesting stuff to read about. Like especially Derek Parfit, I think, has a lot of interesting stuff on identity and the self, because the self and identity are basically the same thing.
You have personhood, which both deals with issues of identity, what makes you the same person over time, but also with the idea of what makes something a person. At what point does someone become a person? And this connects back to issues in ethics, and specifically applied ethics when you're talking about issues of abortion. And you also have things like properties. So just as you have objects and things out in the world, those things seem to have properties like redness or roundness or sweetness. I'm thinking of an apple if you can't tell. But those properties, what are those things? Do they actually exist? How do they adhere to the objects? And answering the question of do they actually exist, you have specific metaphysical opinions like realism, such as universals or abstract objects really exist in the world. They're not just words we use to describe things. Realism would be an example of a global metaphysical theory, like relativism, process philosophy, physicalism, phenomenalism, monism, logical atomism, dualism, idealism, and more. These are global metaphysical theories that try to explain everything in metaphysics through kind of one lens. Those theories have to go across the various levels of metaphysics and connect. Once again, philosophy is about connection. Connect between metaphysics and other elements of philosophy. So you have studies of interlevel metaphysics like grounding, supervenience, reduction, grounding again, fundamentality, emergence, realization, determinants, determinables, and more. Interlevel metaphysics is talking about how we're playing and how physical or mental states can interact with each other. We also have, very simply, the metaphysics of time, talking about what time is, can time exist?
Dude, this is like, this is how I feel like you hook white girls into philosophy, is talking about the metaphysics of time, That's kind of your in to get white girls to consider philosophy, because they love to think that they're deep by thinking about time, like, don't you know that time is just a concept? Like I've heard people say that to me, and like that's always a good way to kind of, when people say something like that, that's kind of a good way to be like, well, I know you say that time is kind of a concept, but what about, have you ever heard of the A and B series of time? And you can kind of use that to kind of lampoon into your philosophical stuff, and maybe hopefully by the end of that, indoctrinate them into philosophy, get them into the cult and all that. But in all seriousness, it is interesting. I do like it. You know, there's a reason why metaphysics is also one of my favorite fields. Metaphysics and aesthetics, I think, are my two favorite fields in philosophy, probably.
Without change, is time real at all? You'll note, once again, connecting back to logic, time and temporal logic, you have modality, the study of possible worlds, not just
like
the rules that govern what we can say about necessity and possibility, but rather what we're actually talking about. Are there real possible worlds out there that we're talking about when we say something is possible or necessary? You'll notice, once again, connected right next to alethic modal logic, which is the logic that kind of turns this and formalizes these philosophical theories into something that can connect to other disciplines. And of course, we have the study of causation, how cause and effect work. Is there even such a thing as causation?
Hume, that's who you had to.
So that's a brief glimpse into theories that are specifically metaphysical. But there's a lot of realms of philosophy which are a part of metaphysics.
People, by the way, wouldn't even entirely agree with this. Like, he says philosophy of identity. A lot of people just say philosophy of self, you know? Like, this is, there's like not, this is not like perfect, you know? Like, people have other ways of talking about some of these, but, and this is like not all that metaphysics is, because it's pretty broad what it is, kind of, you know, like just kind of by the nature of how it is, kind of like philosophy, you know. Like ethics is pretty clear what's going on, but metaphysics is kind of more like, is kind of like the exploration kind of more part of it a little bit.
Physics are a part of epistemology or have roots in both of those traditions.
Whoa, he's addressing the thing I said.
And that's what we're going to talk about right now. So two big areas of philosophy which are present in both of these areas and are things that I talk about a lot here on the channel are philosophy of religion as well as philosophy of science, which we will very briefly touch on right now. So philosophy of science has many different parts to it, but one of them is scientific methodology. And this kind of leans more on the epistemic side of how science is justified. Philosophy of science works to justify science. So one of the things we look at here is things like the problem of underdetermination. How, when we don't have enough information to determine which theory is true, can we pick a theory rationally? It deals with things like the new riddle of induction, talking about which predicates we use. This is probably more connected to philosophy of language and philosophy of science than anything else. Which predicates we use and how those particular predicates can be predictable over sets of things. And we also talk about the problem of induction, which connects back to inductive reasoning that we were talking about a moment ago, and inductive arguments, which are the basis for science. The problem of induction is talking about how we can ever have a scientific argument that's deductively valid, because that seems impossible given that we can't prove the uniformity of nature, that the future will always be like the past, without assuming that the future will always be like the past. The history of science is another important area of philosophy of science. This is not just cataloging the history of science, but rather talking about the way that our scientific theories shift and change over time, and how we're actually comparing our theories back to a paradigm that exists, and as that paradigm shifts, certain theories may become more or less justified. We're talking about natural kinds within the philosophy of science, especially as we get to our next thing, realism. Natural kinds are those things that exist in the world, and there's a question of, are scientists...
This is kind of weird. I feel like this is pretty indicative of this channel's kind of bias, where they're spending all this time on the philosophy of science and religion. I feel like it's really... You don't really need to go into it like this for the type of video this is. Like, it's kind of weird that these are the two points that they're kind of focusing on. Like, it seems kind of like based on the bias of it. And then I see here they kind of go into language, philosophy of mind. I don't want to... I'm going to skip to where they start talking about language, I think, because this might be worth watching. But I don't think that the religion science part is going to be worth it.
We're going to talk briefly about a couple more categories that are kind of a bit of...
Just because you don't need to know about the philosophy of religion and the philosophy of science to know what philosophy is. Like, that's not really what I'm doing here, and that's not what this video is proposing to do either. So I think it's kind of weird that they're kind of like going into this diatribe about those two things, but, you know, whatever. And then kind of language and the mind at the end. an action. Yeah, see, it's kind of weird that he just kind of like picks a couple things to kind of just talk about at the end, I guess, here, but we'll see what he says.
Crossovers between epistemology and metaphysics, and then we are almost done. We have philosophy of language next. So philosophy of language talks about a lot of things. It deals with meaning. What does a certain word mean? It deals with semantics. Does it mean something different when a different person says it? Is 5 equals 5.
This is really related to linguistics also.
25. Can I mean something if I'm talking about things that don't exist, like the King of France? And so on. We also study truth. Truth is one of those things like beauty that's a big idea in philosophy, that when someone goes into philosophy and has no idea what they're talking about, they say, I want to study truth. There are many, many different theories of truth, and we have a huge series on You Can't Handle the Truth, where we cover a lot of these different theories, from coherentism to correspondence theories of truth to Tarski's.
Don't let this make you think that there is no such thing as the truth, though, because there is absolutely 100% such a thing as something that is true. And like, I don't like any of these like postmodern bullshit things that want to come in and say like, well, there's no true, because yes, there is. And like, we have good ways of verifying this that work and provide good outcomes. And I think that they are worthwhile. But there's definitely a lot of people who will say that, like, who will kind of question the notion of truth and stuff like that. But I think that if you kind of disregard our notion of truth, I think that there's a lot of things that would be like absolute trash for our life. Like, I think that accepting the idea that there is such a thing as the truth and that things are true is incredibly important. And I think it's just smarter to do. So don't get confused when they try to somewhat semi-undermine the notion of truth here, because remember, we have very good ways of kind of talking about and determining the truth through our systems of logic and whatnot. So don't get tripped up here.
Theories about the indefinability of truth, and so on and so forth. Philosophy of language also deals with specific expressions in philosophy, and once again, how those expressions can be kind of quantified and turned into logical expressions that we can very clearly evaluate the truth or at least validity of. These are things like indexicals, demonstratives, nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, names, determiners, modal expressions, predicates, quantifiers, questions, quotations, conditionals, temporal expressions, generics, connexive, descriptive, and more. So that's the philosophy of language. Once again, it's something that kind of bridges epistemology, things that are happening in our head, with metaphysics, things that are happening in the world, also with logic, things that exist in formal systems. So it's one of those kind of bridging disciplines. Another bridging area of philosophy is the philosophy of mind.
This is a very important field of philosophy, especially right now, like in this current moment, because trying to understand the mind is like one of the biggest mysteries in like science and philosophy right now. So there's a lot of really interesting and important stuff in the philosophy of mind for sure, and it definitely, I think, is I mean, it falls under metaphysics for sure, but it's relevant enough that I think it's worth kind of talking about separately, I guess.
Is the study of your mind, what you're thinking about. It deals with things like the philosophy of consciousness. What makes something conscious? Could you have a philosophical zombie wandering around that doesn't have consciousness but does everything that we do? At what point can we consider a computer consciousness? If it acts just like a person, is it effectively a person and does it have consciousness? Philosophy of mind also talks about mental states. Belief is a big one in philosophy because it's so closely related to knowledge and epistemology, but there are other mental states like emotions such as anger, fear, love, disgust. There's a big element of happiness, especially if you go back to ancient Greek philosophy, where you're talking about what does it mean to have a good life led. But also looking at mental states, we're looking at kind of some of those interlevel metaphysical theories of how do mental states interact with physical states. Is it possible for mental states to interact with a physical state or change a physical state, or can a physical state cause a mental state but not the other way around? We also had the philosophy of perception. We were talking about perception as a source of information or an epistemic source back in epistemology. What actually is perception? Here we're talking about the metaphysics of it. What is the perception you're receiving? When you see something in your head, when you have that image, is that an image of something in the world, or is that an image of something in between, some perception that your eye has caught onto? Could we understand the world if we were missing one of our senses? What does our...
All right, I'm going to skip to the full map part now because I think we kind of got the important parts, I think. They're going to talk about philosophy of action next, which is you can check that out if you want, but you're not going to probably get that much out of it in terms of understanding what philosophy is.
And so now I give you the map of philosophy. Apologies that this video was so long. There are so many elements of philosophy to talk about. Please.
So I guess overall, I'm not a huge fan of the way that they kind of went about mapping this out. I guess there was a lot of good things and worthwhile things. Like I think kind of emphasizing how logic is kind of at the core, at the heart of this. I think is pretty important, and kind of the way that they started talking about this, I think was a very good way to start. I guess to kind of explain how all other fields kind of come from philosophy. I think that was a good, helpful thing to do. But I think that the way that they separated epistemology and metaphysics was pretty weird. I guess I see why kind of how they did stuff like this, I guess, and they're kind of acknowledging that epistemology and metaphysics are related by kind of putting them on the same side and kind of talking like they did at the end and kind of saying that these are kind of in a gray area there, kind of, so I guess that it's a pretty good job. I think I added on the important things that I needed to that I would have wanted to add on to this to kind of make sure that anybody who would see this would get a better understanding of what philosophy is. So I think that went pretty well, I'd say. And it was an interesting video.